I'm delighted to welcome you all to the third in our Civility in Speaking series. Thank you again to the ESU team, especially Anthony Harris and Rachel Fernandez and others for enabling us again. And we're again reaching out across the world here, so welcome and good morning, early afternoon to those in the United States and also to those in Australia who are again up before dawn has broken. As chair of the ESU, I also want to welcome you all on behalf of this charity, which was formed a century ago in the belief that more effective communication would lead to improved global understanding. Our mission is, as you have seen from that wonderful introductory video, is to empower young people from all backgrounds worldwide, particularly the more disadvantaged, through the promotion of oracy, public speaking and debating programs in order to create a fairer and more tolerant world in which every voice can be heard and understood, and the key to this particular series, respected. It's been a great privilege for me to chair this series of discussions beginning in September, and against the backdrop of what has seemed to be radically changing standards of public debate and discourse, when bluntly, politicians and world leaders have seemed to be far ruder, far more aggressive than before, and when social media broadcasts from them, but also from many people in general, seems more disrespectful with its statements and interventions. But perhaps, and it will be very interesting to hear perhaps at one point about this tonight, certain things might be changing, at least in the United States, although there has to be this fear that a great deal of damage has already been done. So tonight, a timely question for us that takes us back to basics, and we hope will generate a broad discussion and questions. Why do we debate? I'm both excited and privileged to introduce our very distinguished panel. Coming this evening from Newcastle is our opening speaker, Dr. Katie East. Katie, whom you might recently have heard on Melton Bragg's In Our Time, is a lecturer in the history of radical ideas at Newcastle University, with a particular interest in how public debate functioned as a means of promoting civic engagement in early modern England. Katie is now exploring how these historical lessons can inform integration of debate into contemporary education, with an emphasis on debate as a collaborative and as a solution-finding process, rather than a competitive and polarizing one. And that's informed her teaching, where she's designed a course in the history department called Rules of Engagement, which introduces students to the history of debating in order to offer positive examples of debate and public discussion. So we'll hear from Katie very shortly. But I'm also delighted to introduce our other two contributors. I'm thrilled to have with us Bilal Mahmood, who is a fellow ESU board member and is a senior legal consultant for China Construction Bank. Bilal first started debating at the age of 16 and has taken part in numerous English-speaking debating programs, including the school's MACE, debate tours in Mauritius and Japan, and trials for the World Schools Debating Championships. But his involvement doesn't stop there. Since taking part in those programs, he's volunteered extensively for mentoring a new generation of participants, and is also now for the second time on our charity's Board of Governors. And finally, but most certainly not least, and continuing our principle of having one of our panel speaking to us from outside the United Kingdom, is Professor Christopher Peterson, a United States attorney, legal scholar, and the John J. Flynn Endowed Professor of Law at the University of Utah's S.J. Quinney College of Law, where he's speaking from tonight. Chris specializes in consumer protection law, and he served as a finance official for the Obama administration, where he focused on protecting US armed forces members from predatory lending. But most recently, he was, with notable national and international interest, the Democratic candidate for the governorship of the state of Utah. International interest focused on the remarkable joint public service announcement that Chris made with his Republican rival, calling for more civility in public and political discourse, and for a peaceful transfer of power in the 2020 elections. On Twitter, Chris wrote, "I'm not sure this has ever been done before, but as our national political dialogue continues to decline, my opponent and I decided to try something different. We can disagree without hating each other." You're very welcome, Chris, on the panel tonight. So welcome to the panel. At this point, we hear virtual clapping, and in a moment, Katie will begin. Bilal and Chris will respond with various points and discuss, and then we will open the discussion to all of you. I'm now going to go straight to Katie to open the discussion tonight. Over to you, Katie.
Thank you, first of all, so much for the invitation to join you this evening, James. It's a real treat to be able to talk about this, which is something of a passion project of mine. I'm going to speak mostly about the module I developed that James outlined there, and some of the rationale and methods involved, and what I learned from the experience, really. Just to give some sort of further context to myself, as James said, I'm a lecturer in the history of radical ideas, specifically radical ideas in early modern England. And one of my key interests that has developed over recent years is the way in which debate has been used by both sort of more conservative figures and more radical figures as a tool to try and integrate radical ideas into the public and more mainstream discourse, and how that could be managed from both sides, from both sort of conservative, radical, heterodox, orthodox, and so on. And that interest was combined with an observation and experience that led me to thinking about debate in education, particularly at university level. And that was, so there's sort of various rationales behind it, but one of the main ones was that in a university system where we depend quite extensively, particularly in the humanities, on seminars as a form of education, I noticed the huge discrepancy in evidence in terms of students' ability and confidence to engage with that process. Seminars are the forum in which you are encouraged to debate ideas, to question the ideas from authority figures, as a good radical would do, and to offer your own interpretation and to engage with your peers and your lecturer and express yourself in that way. But it's a system that struggles immensely when students lack the confidence or the experience to do that. And inevitably, that's a discrepancy that really, I think, to a large extent was based on diverse socioeconomic backgrounds of students, the students who came from an educational system where that was encouraged and facilitated as part of their day-to-day education, that building of confidence, had a clear advantage over those for whom that was not part of the established educational system. And while there are lots of really interesting groups doing a lot of work to try and make that form of experience and education more accessible to students from less affluent backgrounds, there's still, that's still sort of not quite let's say. So I thought a module at university level which could engage with students on the question of debate and try and build confidence in both public speaking, but also the process of debate in a way that's kind of obviously in an educational setting is encouraging and productive, would be really useful. So there was the sort of rationale on that immediate level, the greater rationale being, of course, what James has already spoken to, which is when you sit and observe the state of public discourse, public debate at the moment, it's a really depressing sight. And what action can I as an educator take except try and instill some kind of civic awareness in students? So that was sort of the rationale at that level. In terms of the approach I took with the module, it studied the history of debate across the early modern period, broadly from 1640s to 1800, because there were three main reasons for that. The first being that that was the period in which we saw a sort of evolution of parliamentary debate as we recognise it today. So it brought a kind of full circle understanding to matters. The second being the traditional Habermas theory of the evolution of the public sphere across that period, the movement of debate from the sort of closeted privacy of Parliament in the early part of the 17th century to the public sphere, to the point where by the 1800s, parliamentary debates are being printed and circulated, and everything that goes along with that. And of course, that third point, the growth of print culture, the sort of echoes of the online culture that we deal with now, that reaction to how to manage debate in print when it's much more widely accessible. So we looked at a series of examples to draw out how debate developed in the public sphere across that period. But the main approach I wanted to take, and sort of what James and I have talked about in relation to this session today, was to shift the focus away from how to debate, which of course tends to, when people talk about debate, that does tend to be the focus, how to most effectively win the debate, win the argument. So we tried to shift away from that. We obviously looked at strategies of persuasion and so on, but we moved back to the question of, well, why do we debate? What purpose in a civil society is debate meant to have? And that's why we looked at quite a range of things, from parliamentary debate to coffee houses to sermons from the pulpit versus the press in terms of controversies in the early 18th century. Because we wanted to come up with a understanding of the broader function of debate and what role it has in society. Sorry, my cat Fred has come to join in because he's also very interested in debate. And with that in mind, what we discovered actually was that there were two sort of additional rationales to debate that were worth exploring. And that was, first of all, the exploration of provocative ideas. And that was something we particularly identified with sort of the coffee houses, the provision of a space in which very controversial, provocative ideas could simply be explored, not with a view to changing anyone's mind per se, but just to test the boundaries of those ideas. But also, and in particular, debate as a tool for achieving consensus and solution, instead of just persuading the other side to agree with you, working together to try and find a common solution. And that was actually something we found right from the beginning with the first case study we did, which was the Putney debates. And the efforts there to say, okay, we've got these two diverse or even more diverse views within our side of things. Let's get together and talk about how best to reconcile it. It didn't work, but it was an attempt. But even in early theories of the parliamentary debate, as the process of offering a proposal and then people subjecting that to amendments, that the rationale behind that process was that you would gradually find a solution that suited the majority. So that idea of reintegrating into our understanding of debate, that it wasn't a case of for and against, yes or no, competition, but actually it was a valid tool for any sort of civil democratic society to find the most, the broadest consensus for ideas within that. And that civility would be a consequence of that, because of course, if everyone understands the purpose for which a debate is happening, and that it's not a case of you might win or you might lose, that civility should be a natural evolution from that, a natural consequence of that different perception of debate and what it's trying to achieve, was the broad idea. I can talk about how it panned out later on, but I think I've used up my initial time.
Lots and lots of really interesting ideas there. And I certainly got some questions, but I'm going to desist because I want to hand over to Bilal to see, with his experience of debating and mentoring, to see how he reacts to that. Bilal.
I think it was an excellent start to a meaningful conversation around the purpose of debate within civil society, as well as being civil within debates. What I'd like to spend some time on is to focus on the idea of empowerment. Katie talked earlier on about how younger people are somewhat not necessarily always introduced to the idea of debate. And I'll talk a bit about my background and my relationship with the ESU and how that revolves around the power of empowerment when it comes to debate. So as for me, I left school and decided to take a gap year and was keen to be more involved in the charity sector before I started university. And I had debated for and with the ESU, and I put my hand up and said, is there anything I can do and would I be of use? And the ESU were at that time launching the London Debate Challenge, or at that time it was called, I think, the Tesco debate programme. And the purpose of this was to create a mechanic whereby we would go to underperforming schools or schools that had a majority of students from disadvantaged backgrounds, and we would introduce them to parliamentary style schools debating and would pair them up with university mentors that we knew from the debating circuit in university. The purpose of this alone was not just to get kids into debating, though that was valuable as it was. The specific purpose of this program was to ensure that we had a mechanic of mentoring, of empowerment, of developing people's critical listening skills, people's critical thinking skills. And we did it through the medium of debate. And we went to, I think, when I was running it, something around 30 odd schools. I think over the period of 10 or so years, it's reached more than 50,000 young people in London. And I'm sure that we can pull some data for you as a follow-up. And I know that the ESU's done that. And time again, each one of the programs and competitions that we launched, what we came across was lots of passionate people and passionate ideas, but almost a frustration. I think once one person described it as they've got all these things to say, but it gets stuck here. And that resonated with me, and they felt that they didn't have the tools or the ability to articulate an argument rather than just shout. For some people as well, it was a behavioral problem. Teachers thought that this was a problem child who just wanted to be argumentative. They took a couple of classes of us, and through some very straightforward and some very easy tools that we taught, they were able to structure, prioritize, finesse their arguments in a way that showed the disagreement without being disagreeable. And so for me, debate is the debate within schools as a project. It's great to have people involved in competitions, to talk about their confidence, to talk about how to make these points. But for me, it's always been about seeing young people develop the empowerment of being able to be comfortable with their own voice. And this is truer from people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Very often they'll feel what we refer to as imposter syndrome. They don't feel they belong somewhere. They don't feel that they're entitled to speak up in certain places. And debate allows them the tools to take control of their own voice and to be heard and to feel the confidence of being heard. And so for me, teaching debate and the process of it's very much a process in of itself. And I was thinking just before the talk and while Katie was speaking about what we've seen in the past few years from politics in general, but not just in politics, the civil discourse generally. Whether we have in the UK, we've got Brexit. In the United States, we've had a very, very difficult a set of elections, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Chris about that. But all of them, and regardless of what your politics are, I think everybody agreed that what it became was beyond simply a difference of opinion, but a disagreement of people based on their identity or a prejudgment as to what that person represented simply by what certain positions they took. And I think what I found helpful as a debater and somebody who's taught debate was to be able to survive in a world of information overload Many of my friends would often talk to me who haven't debated about how to simply process everything that's happening, and what views to take, and what to make of things. And I found myself going back to the things that I taught as a debate coach with the ESU, which is prioritize your points, structure them, collate them. What's the, and then what's the core red thread? What's your logical analysis, causation? All these basic techniques that I found myself applying just to consuming news or consuming media. And I found it like a life raft in this past couple of years. And it most fundamentally allowed us to be more forensic, but also allowed me to be more patient with not just other people's views to understand where they're trying to come from, but also just double check my own views. Is it based on stereotypes that I have? Is it just a prejudgment on the kind of person who I want to present myself to the wider public? And those skills allowed me, and again, through that empowerment, to have a sense of ownership over my own ideas, allowed me to do that in a way that I don't think the version of me without debate was ever able to do. So for me, and it echoes, I think, very much with what Katie was speaking about, around the idea of what is it about debate in a structured way that gives us tools to empower us, and particularly young people, to be able to engage with civic society more in a more fruitful manner. But I think my time's just about up, so I'll look forward to the other speakers.
Thank you, Bilal, so much. It's really fascinating. And I mean, this question of empowerment, whether empowerment comes from the more participative rather than the competitive, or perhaps a mixture of the two. And going back to another issue that's both of you have touched on, the how in terms of the communicative changes that we've got with different sort of media influences, and the where. And we may come back to the arena of Parliament and whether the parliamentary model is a good one or not in terms of its competitiveness or participativeness and whatever. But really, really fascinating issues. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass immediately over to Chris for his response. Chris, please join us.
Well, thank you, Professor Raven, and thank you to everyone. It's such an honor to be here. It's one of the wonders of our technological world that, all the way across the world, I can join in a panel going on in London from the Mountain West in the United States. As Professor Raven mentioned, I'm a law professor at the University of Utah in my hometown, but I just finished a campaign to be governor of my state, which was a long and difficult, hard-fought campaign. Unsuccessful, didn't prevail, but I did learn quite a bit. And I think that to the extent I have something to add to this conversation, it's about what I perceive to be the changing role of technology platforms in the way that we engage in debate in our civil society. And I want to focus in particular on social media platforms. And by this, I think I mean, first and foremost, Facebook, but also Twitter and Instagram, and maybe some of the other smaller platforms as well. I think that I can see this much more clearly now, having just waged a campaign to try to get about 600,000 people to vote for me, and what that's like, and the pressures that political leaders feel, and the way that those social media platforms are transforming the interaction of people in our society. And just to make sure that we're level setting a bit, Facebook now has become the dominant form of political communication, at least in American society. But I believe that that's happening in many countries around the world. Facebook and its various member companies have about depending on how you count, about 3 billion active users all across the world, and very minimal editing in terms of the kinds of content that gets posted to Facebook and Facebook-related social media platforms. And it's created fertile ground for misinformation, for hate speech. But even putting those issues to the side, it also is the way through which political candidates, and also just putting politics to the side, the way that more and more humans are engaging each other in actual debate outside of sort of organized debate for kids in school, that sort of thing. And it's also, I believe, fracturing the earlier forms of technological communication. Like, for example, in particular, newspapers. In American society, many of the regional newspaper companies across the country are collapsing because their business model is no longer viable. That, I think, and not an insignificant part, is driven by Facebook, which takes the output of journalists, where people who are using the social media platform repost newspaper articles without paying for them. So there's not a direct way that the newspaper company and the journalists who are drafting the newspaper articles are getting paid. But at the same time, for politicians, for political leaders, or aspiring political leaders, to get access to the billions or the millions of people who are getting their information, their news, through Facebook, we have to pay to get the data that would allow us to identify an audience that we could target our communications toward. And then if you want to get outside of your immediate silo of close followers and supporters and friends, you have to pay advertising revenue to the company that has disabled the effectiveness of the newspaper systems. And the challenge is it becomes very expensive, and it's also quite ineffective, I think. And one of the side effects, I think, that I perceive much more clearly now, having been through a hard-fought political campaign, is that these social media platforms, it's not just that they have the eyeballs and that they're gathering up most of the revenue associated with facilitating political or civil conversation. It's that the very nature of those technology platforms themselves imprints itself on the type and tone of debate that we see in our society. So, for example, most people are conglomerating in shared information silos, where people of like mind are recycling information to one another, and to get the most attention, to get the most retweets or shares or likes, that is the lifeblood of getting attention, trying to persuade people. The thing that is most effective at that, aside from just paying to push it, but is outrage. I felt in my own communications enormous pressure to try to spark outrage, anger, incivility, because that's the thing that manages to attract the most attention in those social media platforms. So I feel that as we're training our children and the youth of the future, and as we're thinking about how debate is going to go on in coming generations, we have to continue to pay attention to the way that those platforms are influencing the tone of that debate. My opponent and I, seeing this and talking about it in quiet moments on the campaign trail, decided that we felt that pressure and needed to try to transcend it in some way, and engaged in a joint advertising public service campaign that Professor Raven mentioned, where we talked about together on screen how it's important to not be disagreeable when we disagree, and that we have to maintain that civil tone, or we're going to drift further and further into political camps that can't communicate effectively with each other. So I guess my contribution to this conversation is to encourage those that are shaping the debates of the future to pay to pay attention to how social media platforms are influencing those voices. If we want our children and the people we are training to engage in debate to have a voice that's authentically theirs, that can also be heard, more and more, it's not just in-person communication. It is filtered through the lens of our technological platforms. I wonder if maybe in the future there is a place for debate that's carried on through a technological medium that replicates the kinds of mediums that we engage in as adults and in our civil society. Well, that's what I'll stop there. I know that there are many people who want to chime in and have questions, and I'm happy to share further as James leads us on. Thank you.
And what Chris was saying there was really interesting, I thought, in terms of exclusion, not just because of what Bilal was saying in terms of imposter syndrome and trying to build confidence because of one particular form of it being excluded or feeling unable to debate, but because of practical and technical issues, and of wondering about, going back to what Katie was saying, about where she was talking about print and now in a modern form of new form of communications, of how that communication facilitating is actually creating a problem too. But can I ask, Katie, do you want to come back, and I'll open it up to the panel now to discuss on various things that they've all been sharing here in terms of different ways from those that are actually at the coalface. You're all practicing in various ways, whether it be the classroom or in mentoring young people in the lecture room, or on actually on the political platform to compare some of the things you've been saying. Katie, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. And thank you to Chris and Bilal. It was really interesting. One thing that struck me in terms of something that you both said, which is this sort of, which I think links into what I was trying to say about why we debate, which is this idea of the dismissal of a person because of an aspect of their belief or character or background, or for whatever reason. So obviously, Chris, with the public information event you did with your rival, competitor, I've forgotten the word now. That was obviously about saying, look, we're different politically, but that doesn't make us completely different entities. And as Bilal was saying about, a similar thing of sort of listening and understanding your rival for more than just that one thing. I think it's something we've lost so much, because in public debate now, it's the swiftness with which I see, observing it again through social media and so on, a tendency to say, oh, I disagree with this element of your belief. Right, I'm going to apply a particular word to you and use that word to dismiss every other element of your belief. Whether that's sort of lefty liberal snowflake or something from the other direction, just right, you've said something I disagree with, everything can be dismissed with that one word, which affects you. And I think, again, that's because we don't fully understand at the moment, and this sort of links into what Chris was saying about the social media aspect, is that there's a lack of clarity about what function debate has in our society now. At the moment, it's practically recreational. People will sit there scrolling through Twitter of an evening or going on Facebook of an evening, and it's become a sort of a tool of, well, not relaxation, God knows, but so what function does it really have in our society now? It's become more obscure, almost like the more accessible it is, the more obscure it is. And that's led to this confusion about, if we don't know why we're doing it, it does become more about dismissing your opponent rather than trying to sort of find common ground. My thought on what you guys said. James, I think you're muted again. Oh, Zoom, you and your ways.
No, you're still muted, James.
Something is coming on, and I'm unable to unmute. Apologies. You'll have, if this happens again, please carry on. I was going to ask.
We'll just plow on.
Because I think what you're also saying in there, Katie, about solution and a problem solving, debate as being a solution to something rather than and how could we get back to that? But I could see Bilal nodding away when you were speaking. I wonder whether he wants to come back.
I think there was a specific point that Katie raised that really resonated with me when she said that you disagree with somebody and you label them something. You're a lefty, you're a socialist, you're a crank, you're a gammon, which here in the UK started to be, for some reason, an insult. But it also, I think, the reverse works, where you identify with somebody you think or you believe you should be agreeing with, and therefore feel tied to everything that they say. and I've noticed the flip of that, and that actually is contradictory to the idea of debate and critical thinking and critical listening. So just because, for example, I identify with the type of politician, I admire them, I feel that they are automatically the typology or the political cleavage with which I would want to align myself, I feel like I'm going to have to agree with everything they say. And that takes us away from the idea of debate of thought and debate of ideas, and it brings us towards the clash of debate of people. And I think that's where we're really losing ourselves. Chris brings up some really good examples on Facebook as well, because you start going down a rabbit hole, I think, when it comes to that kind of approach to debate and discourse, because you simply say, well, I agree with this all the time. You're like, okay, but then what about this scenario? Well, okay, I agree with it except for this. And then you start kind of almost debating yourself into a hole that you can't get out of, or into a corner that makes positions untenable. And I think for me, as a personal perspective, I know lots of debaters at university, and we were all quite political one way or another. We're like, rabid conservatives, or the grandchildren of Karl Marx or something, and there was nothing in between. But as time went on, through debates, there was a great leveling. People were still of political views, but they were much more, and maybe it's because people are married with kids, I don't know. But whatever experience it was, people are much more able to understand positions of the other side, are much more willing to engage in discourse on particular points. Now, that could be a generational point, because we, of course, are not really from a social media age, debating social media age. So I think this generation has an added layer of difficulty, because it's this information war, as it were, is constant, and it is all encompassing. And I think that becomes, I really was very impressed with what Chris was saying, especially given his experience of running to be a governor as well. The onslaught that he must have personally experienced, just to be able to get a point across, you've got to kind of, as they say, triangulate in so many ways. And that's just with like good old-fashioned media, with journalists, or in print, or on face-to-face meetings. But then to have that taken into social media spheres where you have no control over it. The point, and I feel like what we're all saying is the art of discourse is being lost for the sake of argument, and for the sake of almost showmanship combat, which is gruesome and very instinctive, but not the higher levels of kind of Grecian philosophy and discourse that we had all hoped to have done when we did debate of some kind.
Is that going to change, Chris, in the States, do you think?
Well, I don't know about that, Professor Raven. I mean, I worry that the, perhaps shift to a more civil tone that perhaps we've seen a bit of in our most recent election is quite tenuous, because of the underlying structural way in which we are now driven towards outrage. I spent a lot of time thinking about, what my messaging was going to be. Everybody I spoke with, all the strategists, that was the first thing they want to talk about, is what's the message that's really going to resonate. But pretty quickly, I realized that messaging, what the right message itself was the easiest part by far. What was hard was getting that message to penetrate to the number of eyeballs that I had to get to actually persuade the people I needed to actually turn around and vote for me. And one of the things that one of my campaign, just for context for those that are viewing, I am a Democrat in the state of Utah, very conservative Republican state. The platform that I chose to run on, though, in a state that's been almost a one-party state, our politics has drifted further and further to our political right. And so now there are a number of very important public policy issues in my state where the existing leadership is actually on the wrong side of a majority or even a supermajority of the residents of my state. So without going into the details of each of these policy issues, my campaign was focused on about 6 or 7 7 policy issues where a broad majority of voters in my state agree with me and not my opponent, even though I'm the Democrat. But to try to actually push that message out and get people to see it was virtually impossible, because the way that you communicate through social media is by being more outrageous than the next candidate, or you can get to people with TV advertisements, television advertisements. But there, the way that you get to them is by the ads are easy. It's getting the money to run the ads, and for that, the way to do it is by appealing to very powerful people who have vested political interests, and oftentimes they are on the exact wrong side of each of those 6 or 7 issues that I talked about, and so the way to penetrating in and getting to people with that message was virtually impossible, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter, how good the message was, it wasn't really in the end about me. It was about the structure through which my message was going to be filtered and ultimately rendered inept. Is that going to, and I guess my point, to answer your question, James, that hasn't changed. Those structures are still very much in place. And the fact that, we're kind of speaking around President Trump, who is a master at manipulating those information systems, both because he is delighted to appeal to the lowest common denominator, but policy, in terms of policy, is crafted his policy to be very deferential to powerful interests, and is a machine of outrage and vindictiveness and gathering eyeballs. He's a genius at getting people to pay attention to him. He's a perfect storm for manipulating the information structures that we've created for ourselves. Those information structures are still in place, and the fact that he kept it as close as he did, despite our catastrophic pandemic and the worst economic recession since the Great Depression of the 1920s, chills me. I am frankly worried that we may be drifting further and further towards political violence, and I don't want to say civil war. I don't think that we're there yet, but I worry that those same impulses are still there, and we really haven't reformed the underlying structures that made President Trump so effective. I'll stop though. I'm going on now.
No, I mean, it's very serious. And what you say really reinforces the huge importance of the work which the ESU is doing, but all of us individually are doing here. And we're talking about tonight about having a model of debate and of talking about the shared opinions across and offering of different perspectives in different ways, irrespective of these problems in terms of the different types of platform. But I want to open it out to, and there's a lot I can see on my screen, a lot of flashing questions coming up. So I'm going to hand over to Anthony to open it up to questions from our audience, because there's so much here. Thank you for the panel for the moment.
Okay, thank you, James. Well, as I said a little earlier, the best way to ask a question is if you hit the raise hand button, and we can open up your microphone and actually hear from you. And I see a couple coming up already. I've got one from Matthew Christmas. I'll open your lines up.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
So I'd like to ask the panel the question, do you think there was ever a period when there was genuinely overridingly civil debate in society? I don't mean a golden age, but when there was a general sort of acceptance of different views and coming to terms with those. And if you think there was, and you may not, when did we lose it? When did that society or country lose it? And why, do you think? Because it does seem to me it is getting progressively worse, but Katie, as a historian, may utterly disagree and say it's much better than it was in, say, the Georgian period. I don't know. Thank you.
Do you want to start us off, Katie?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And essentially, there's no sort of golden age or perfect point. And this kind of links back to what Bilal and Chris were saying in their most recent answers, which is you have to factor human passion into it. And I think that speaks a lot to that, what Bilal was saying about sort of an unquestioning affiliation with a particular person. There's some really interesting stuff about sort of Trump voters who had sort of gone too far down the Trump line and now just had to support him, whatever. and that kind of unquestioning devotion. So there's always human passion. There were periods, the 18th century, certainly the first half of it, where the discussion of public debate was framed entirely in terms of civility. Of course, what you have there is a period when that public debate is dominated almost exclusively by elites. So, what we have seen over centuries of history is the integration of more and more voices into public discourse. And obviously, I assume none of us would want to see that turned back in time. So while there's always been, there have been periods of time where calls for civility have been quite explicit, that's often in that context partnered with a sort of elitism and don't know why I just tried to say a word that I can never say, but a kind of aristocratic rule, because civility kind of evokes that. But it's an interesting question, and is one that sort of is a future research project I'm working on, which is looking at the sort of major occurrences of public discourse from Republican Rome to Renaissance Florence to England, and to try and figure out if there are coherent patterns of when it works and when it doesn't. So basically, no, is the answer.
And of course, one dimension we haven't perhaps touched enough on so far is the global aspects of this. The sort of media that we were talking about now means that some of the dangers that Chris was talking about and some of the problems is actually on such a widespread scale. The same media that gives us the opportunities to have this sort of panel discussion around the world are also those that offer that type of exclusion that we were hearing about, and the bad models too. But
also, sorry, just it depersonalizes it as well. Coming back to the Facebook, Twitter thing, people will say things via these mediums that they would never dream of saying if they were face to face with that individual, or I hope they would never dream of saying face to face. So that depersonalization from the globalization as well. Sorry, James.
Yeah, just see whether the others have other comments.
Okay, let's take another question then, James. We've got Nigel Curry. Open your line up.
Thank you. I suppose this one went to Chris and maybe Bilal as well. Despite President Trump's facility with the social media, he still lost. So isn't that something we should be encouraged by?
Well, I'm certainly encouraged by it, but obviously I'm a Democrat and worked in the Obama administration, and I endorsed Joe Biden, and Joe Biden endorsed me. So I would certainly be encouraged. I do think, though, that I am still nervous because I was hoping that, frankly, we would have a bit of a wave election, or what we call a wave election in America. And Democrats lost seats in the House of Representatives, picked up one so far in the Senate, and we still have the chance, the Democrats still have the chance to take the Senate in a runoff election that's currently going on, with 2 seats up for grabs in Georgia, a state that President Biden won, but very narrowly and only for the first time in many years. I do, and I in my own home state where I'm from, obviously not particularly important globally, but Democrats made very limited progress, I think, because of some of the same structures that I was talking about. And I think that given what a mess our country is right now, economically and in terms of public health, one would have suspected that Democrats would have done much, much better. There is a rising tide of tribes that are really having great difficulty communicating and compromising in our country, and I don't think that has been solved yet. I am still nervous about it. I do think that there is reasons for hope, though, and I believe that we have to keep working to try to understand each other and overcoming the challenges we're facing. I think it's critical that the Biden administration makes progress on some of our long-standing social and economic and political challenges in the country, or in 2 years we could be facing a very, very different political reality.
Are you more optimistic, Bilal?
Not really. I think the concern. Yes, he did lose, and there is something to be gained from that. But at the same time, I think it is what his revisionist populism has unleashed on the world, and it has shown other people a way of a path to power with the lack of decency. Which is my personal opinion. I'm sure. I mean, there are at least 70 million people in the world who disagree with me on that. So, my concern about it is that it's a Pandora's box that is opening up a form of, and I think Katie referred to it as that politics of the least common denominator. Maybe it was Chris. I'm not quite sure, but it's that. I still think debate and politics should be about aspiring to the best version of ourselves. Like there's that almost like classical Greek civic duty about things, and I think that this type of mudslinging is not really the right term of it. It's a visceral hatred of the entity opposite you, rather than just. Yeah, so obviously I'm a big fan of debating. I'm not sure many people know this. I spent some time in Virginia in the US. I myself ran for a parliamentary seat in the UK. So the intersection of politics, the US, and debate kind of chime with me quite well. And one of my guilty pleasures is to YouTube old presidential debates, going back to Kennedy, Nixon. And while I would, I'm a Labour politician, I'm left leaning. I consider myself in the US a Democrat. I would marvel at how President Reagan would debate, or Mondale, or any of the debates that he would have. I would disagree with opinions, but it was still an understanding of having a mutual sense of respect, of himself being able to, and with his own civility, elevate his own arguments. And I think that's something we sometimes lose in the Trumpian world of mudslinging, is that actually it's not just about being polite, it's actually about winning as well. Like there's something inherent about, I think it was, I can't remember, there's the three keys of classical debate, which is ethos, pathos, and logos. And it's we can do the logos, or logos has gone out the window, which is logic and ideas, and it seems to be all pathos. But there's a bit of that ethos, which is, who is that person in front of me? Are they credible? Are they authentic? And civility is almost the shortcut for that. I do fear that's been lost a bit, and I don't think it's just happening in the US. I mean, we can see it down in Brazil. We can see it happening in parts of the European Union, in Hungary, and outside of the English-speaking world as well. Like you can see it with many other politicians who are driving home this populism, regardless of politics. So the BJP and Prime Minister Modi in India as well could arguably be taking a similar style from Trumpian politics and applying it there, which could have massive and very dangerous consequences. So I'm probably even more pessimistic than Chris is, but who knows? Maybe Joe can pull out the bag.
I hear.
I chime in with some positivity.
Yeah, I hear what you say, I'm determined. I think Katie's going to say this too, but I'm determinedly optimistic. I'm trying to be optimistic, and I do think some of those 70 million did actually vote with a peg on their nose, and perhaps are crying out for a different model. And as Bilal says, going back to a different form of Republican civility and the type of Reagan debate. And the optimist in me says that perhaps out there is a counter populist urge going on. But Katie, you wanted to come in. I interrupted.
No, I interrupted you. As my positive take is that I was losing sleep for months prior to the election at the thought of him winning, and that could have happened. Yes, 17+ million voted, which is terrifying, but he could have won, and that would have been utterly terrifying, because that would have been a validation of all of that, of all of what he represents on a scale that we wouldn't have been able to comprehend. So it could have been a lot worse.
Next question, Anthony.
Okay, I think we'll take one that's been written in, slightly different topic, and I'm conscious of the time, so perhaps we could do a couple of slightly briefer responses to these last couple of questions. One here looking at the culture in business life, where leaders who drive forward their own ideas are often described as talented and reap very high rewards. Does that not confront the idea that inclusive debate should be welcome in society at large?
Chris, do you want to take that?
Well, I'm just trying to think about what I think about that question. I think I'm drifting back to a point that I made earlier. I mean, so many of the most innovative and exciting businesses here in America are technology driven, and the business leaders of those businesses often don't have accountability to the social and economic challenges that we're facing, and we don't. And the thing that's short-circuiting the way that America has managed to keep a balance between business versus management versus labor or working people has working people could rise up and use political power to bring business to heel from time to time. But now the businesses that are most successful and some of the most powerful businesses are based on information systems that themselves short circuit the information and the civil debate that we would use to try to build political pressure to undermine those businesses. I'm not sure that's really responsive to what the question was, but information-based businesses are uniquely situated to disable the political structures that we used to undermine businesses that usurp too much power for themselves. I'm not sure that was really responsive to the question, though, but I'll stop there.
Okay, let's take one live from James Scrooby. James, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yes, good evening, and thank you all. Great discussion. I'm really enjoying it. I'd like some solutions, please. We've talked about people disappearing into silos, a lot of unreliable information on social media. I'd be very interested, briefly, from each of you in your ideas as to where the solution to this lies.
Who wants to kick off? Bilal, yeah.
I think the answer is James is getting more English-speaking union debate programs across the country and wider in the world is probably a great start. We can't fix everything overnight, is absolutely the case, but what we can do is start with that kernel of empowerment, of civility, of structure, of people having, young people particularly, having a sense of confidence over their own ideas and also what they want to be, what they want to digest through various form of media, and for them to be able to constructively critique what they're hearing and what they can think about. And I think that's a stepping stone in the right place. Beyond that, personally, I do think there's a lot more about regulating social media and the way in which it passes on information, but that's well beyond the scope of this discussion. But for me, it's those programs of seeing, and we've all seen this together, of the great work and positive benefit it's had, and it's been transformative for some of the young people that we've seen and we've worked with. Many of you on this call may know Lewis Iwu, for example, was one of the first mentees I had from the English-speaking union from East London in Forest Gate. We met when he was 14. He's now he was Oxford University's first Black Student Union president. He was World Debating Championship twice, I think. He's coached the England team 3 times. He's now set up his own successful comms company. Is often referred to in the media as the next Black Obama. The next British Obama. And it's we have the ability to do that here. And those are the kind of examples that we can show the wider community how to deal with. And that's where I would start with the ESU and their programs.
Thank you, Bilal. James, are you happy to take 1 or 2 more quick questions?
So if we go, we're running over time a little bit, but it's such a good discussion. Let's have a couple of more quick questions if the panel's happy with that, please.
Okay, let's go to Ellen Punter, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Good evening. I want to say thank you very much to all of the speakers this evening. Very engaging, very varied comments and ideas, and very stimulating to listen to you all. So thank you for that. I work locally. I'm a local branch of the ESU in Bedfordshire, and I also judge and I'm adjudicator for the ESU. And I want to ask you a question based around the young people. So my question is, in England, it's the pantomime season coming up. In America, I'll have to be thinking about fairy tales, maybe. It'd be nice if they do happen with the COVID going on. But if you could wave a magic wand, what would one piece of positive advice you would give to our young people, especially those at the current moment taking part in ESU competitions locally, nationally and internationally, on why they should debate, given all the parameters of the discussion that I have just listened to? And we could have young listeners, debaters that are part of the audience this evening.
Let's go around the panel and starting with Katie. One quick piece of advice in answer to Ellen's question.
A lot of pressure. Believe your voice matters. It does. Whatever you say, your voice does matter, and only you can use it. So, you know, you got to use it more eloquently than me.
Oh, that's wonderful. Empowerment again, Chris.
Well, I think that it's important to continue to debate, to shape your ability to make cogent and thoughtful arguments that resonate with people, and that essential human characteristic has not changed, despite all of the technology, all of the changing politics, all of that. The thing that really, at the end of the day, matters is your ability to communicate with one another, and debate continues to be a critical tool in honing that message.
Thank you. Bilal, what would you say?
Disagreeing with other people makes you know yourself better. And if there's one thing that matters in life is to know yourself.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I think that those are three wonderful responses. I think I would respond as well and say, Ellen, to be a participant and not just a competitor, and to understand those around you, what they are actually saying in a way which you can actually use effectively to solve problems that you can identify. But let's have another question.
Let's go to Anne Eyre. Anne, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted now. It's a slightly different topic, but in the church debate in the Church of England about sexuality, these polarities are running riot at the moment. I'm really trying to find a way of opening conversations that have respect and do not do the labelling, which I think Chris referred to. What are the primary skills needed to make any opening? I need help.
How do we foster respect?
Well, I suppose I'll jump in. I think that one of the most important parts about debating and is listening and hearing other people, because that's the pathway through which we find compassion and find shared factual understanding and shared meaning. I'm not sure that really is very helpful, but for the question. But I do think that it's a critical component, and listening to one another is just as important as being able to speak.
If I may as well, this is something we sort of talked about on the module, because as part of their assessment, they were designing a debate, saying, okay, now we understand the function, or have a sense of the function of debate in society, let's construct. And when we were talking about what they might debate, we got into the sort of realm of topics that we couldn't comfortably debate rationally. So I sort of gave them a couple of examples of things where I just feel so strongly that sometimes I know that, and I know I can't debate rationally. So I think perhaps having frank conversations like that, just to say, I feel really strongly about this, and to encourage that level of respect and honesty and frankness about particularly controversial topics. And also just inquisitiveness, say, if you're not sure about terminology to use, ask. People want to talk about it and to explain their experiences and points of view. So just create the space for people to say they're uncomfortable or to speak about what they see the purpose, again, it's the purpose of the discussion being, would be my advice.
Bilal.
Just briefly, I think when we say the words debate with a capital D, that's often a very kind of competitive, adversarial type of debate. With subject matters like this, we still talk about the notion of debate, i.e. discourse, but there are different formats that will allow to generate something to flourish. So perhaps labeling it less as a debate, more as a mediation or as a discourse, perhaps might be. And you'd be amazed at how these small changes in terminology might help people come to the table a bit more, focusing more on the commonalities that everybody shares. You know, obviously here would be your shared faith, talking about what brings you to the church. I think maybe a good time to focus on that, even as if you're breaking them out in sessions. And then for you, once you've got that common unity and understanding and reaffirming that with one another, then to branch out on topics that are more divisive. And perhaps laying, as Katie set out, some of the ground rules of this certain terminology that's just not welcome in this discourse. But it is a difficult one. But there is something to be said of tweaking the mechanics by which people debate or discourse this, and terminology that actually gets people to buy in, as they would say, a lot more.
Oh, James, just one last question, okay. I think, if we could. Because I know the title of our panel tonight was "Why Do We Debate?" So let's take a question from the Q&A here that's been written in. Is learning how to debate a good thing in itself, or should it be seen as an essential step in the road to rational decision-making?
Essential or not?
Unsurprisingly, I consider it essential, and will be making a case for its integration more into citizenship education in the curriculum in the UK, because I genuinely do believe it is vital, particularly as the information age we enter into. One of the questions earlier was sort of what would you do? What's the main thing we need? And for me, it will always be education, and education will solve all of these issues. So ensuring that access to that for everyone in education and not just an elite few would be part of that.
A brief word from the others before we close, Chris and Bilal.
Well, there's some heady philosophical questions there. Heady philosophical question. I don't know whether or not debate is intrinsically good in and of itself. I guess if I were looking into my own heart, I would say it vindicates my existential angst, or maybe the resistance gives meaning internally to me, irrespective of whether or not it makes that essential step towards logical reasoning. I feel better after I debate.
I have nothing to add.
I do want to say thank you so much to our panel this evening. This has really been an absolutely fascinating discussion and a really worthy conclusion to our session on our speaking session. Sorry that my screen is going strange. Of our series this year. So thank you so much to Katie for starting off. Thank you so much to Bilal and to Chris for joining us from Utah. This has been really, really a very wonderful evening, and thank you for the questions and for all of you participating. I think by being here tonight, you share our values in the ESU, and it certainly should inspire us, I think, to work all the harder, to work with those young people, to volunteer and to be a member of the ESU, to encourage our programs going forward, because the work we're doing is so important in providing an opportunity for debate and to thinking, as we've heard this evening, not just how we debate, but actually why we debate and what those ends are. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you again to the panel and to you. And I'll just say good night, wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon. Stay safe, and if it's not too early to say so, a very merry and secure Christmas to you all.